Supply Management Canada's system of quotas and tariffs for dairy, chicken, eggs, and turkey is back under the microscope, with Donald Trump again complaining about how Canada treats U.S. farmers. Those who support supply management argue that it gives farmers a stable income, creates markets with more stable prices, and ensures Canadian food sovereignty. Those who disagree, however, argue that the system artificially inflates prices for Canadians while preventing Canada from realizing its trading potential in global markets. One of those critics is our contributor, David Clement, who joins me now in studio. So, David, I want to start with what is supply management, and is there any truth to Donald Trump's complaints about it?
So the best way to describe supply management would be it's two parts. One is quotas. So that's essentially a license to produce, to limit the supply, hence the supply management part. The second part is quotas. The quotas range depending on the trade deal over a certain threshold, but it's usually between, I would say, 150 to 300%. So it's extremely significant. We're talking about 35% tariffs from the US. And when it comes to these products, what we don't see on Canadian shelves is because they would be essentially priced out of the market because the tariff is so high. Is there merit to when he says the tariff is as high as 400%? No. But it is as high as 300%, again, depending on the product. And it's something that Donald Trump complained about in his first term. It's something that the Biden administration actually initiated a formal dispute mechanism under the USMCA. And now it's come back again with a vengeance.
And how does supply management impact Canadian consumers?
So first, it significantly limits access to international products. So a lot of this debate is framed in the context of the US because they're the ones who are complaining about it now. But almost all of Europe complained about it during the CETA negotiations. The potential trade deal with the UK fell through because we weren't going to give their farmers access to these markets. The Australians have complained about it. The Kiwis in New Zealand have complained about it. So what it does is it significantly limits competition in Canadian grocery stores because when it comes to those products, pretty much all we have access to is Canadian. And when you have lower competition, that puts upward pressure on prices because there's no competition between different brands, different companies, etc. And so on average, we see Canadians pay between 20, 30, as high as 40% more for these products than they otherwise would without supply management. And to give you a picture of why that matters or what the kind of total cost is. So it's more than $500 per year per family. And that might not sound a lot, like a lot to some people. But when you look at those who are living at the poverty line, an extra $500 a year actually pushes almost 200,000 Canadians below the poverty line, while at the same time we have a record number of Canadians lining up at food banks. So it's something that the Trump administration is now focused on again. But I would make the argument, regardless of what Trump says about supply management, it would be worth getting rid of it because it's inflationary at a time when Canadians have been struggling significantly with food inflation, general cost of living, and the overall economic situation that we're in.
And what about food sovereignty? Those who support supply management argue that we shouldn't rely on other countries for things that we can produce ourselves. What would your response to that be?
So it's interesting. We don't do supply management for anything else. So the supporters of supply management will say, we need it because if we don't have it, then American product will dominate the Canadian marketplace and we won't have Canadian dairy farms anymore and we can't rely on them. They're not a reliable trading partner. There's a couple problems with that perspective. One, we already know what it's like to have free trade with the United States and other agricultural products. So prior to this latest trade dispute, under the USMCA, there were no tariffs on American beef. There are no tariffs on American pork. If the supporters of supply management and their viewpoint was accurate, what we would have seen is we would have seen American beef completely wipe out Canadian beef. We would have seen US pork completely wipe out Canadian pork. The best estimate is that US beef accounts for about 13% of what's consumed in Canada, and US pork accounts for about 20% of what's consumed in Canada. So it just never came to fruition. The idea that we that they would dominate and we would lose all of our farms just never happened. So the idea that it would happen for chicken or turkey or dairy in a way that it didn't for beef, I don't think has much merit. But it's also important to note that, so some critics will say, yeah, but the US had extreme volatility in eggs because of bird flu, which of course they did. And they'll use that anecdote to justify Canada's system of supply management by saying, see, we didn't have that price volatility because we only really produced for the domestic market. The problem with that viewpoint is that when you only rely on domestic producers for a particular product, if we had had a bird flu spread through the Canadian chicken flock, we would have had nowhere to go because everything we would have imported to try and cover the gap would have been tariffed at 150, 200%. So we would have seen price volatility for something like chicken or eggs go through the roof because supply management makes it so incredibly difficult for international competition to send products to the Canadian market. So I would argue that it actually makes the Canadian food system more resilient when you have the world as your marketplace, rather than just having one country be the sole producer of all these products.
And we've seen a lot of complaints about product quality from the US. Is there a big difference?
Yeah, so this happens all the time. People will say, well, US dairy farmers use hormones. I go to Buffalo rather regularly, and I do the same thing every time I go. I take a picture of the back of a carton of milk that says in bold letters, we don't use the acronym for the hormone. And so a lot of those claims turn out to be myths. But even if they were true, that's okay, because just because something can be sold in Canada doesn't mean that people are going to buy it. And ultimately, that's up to consumers to decide for themselves. I'll give you an example. Spam. I think it's particularly disgusting. It exists and is sold on Canadian shelves. It doesn't mean that everybody is buying spam. There are a couple, maybe who I consider strange people who really enjoy it, but it's available and it doesn't completely take over the market because you have this, let's say, lower quality, lower price product on the shelves. Ultimately, that's up to Canadians. I think we can trust them to make that decision for themselves. And when it comes to the lower kind of quality argument, when you actually parse through each industry, the differences are almost negligible. There's very little difference. And the Canadian industry has its own quality problems. I mean, you look at Buttergate, where it was found out that dairy farmers were using palm oil in the butter creation process, feeding cows, dairy cows, palm oil, which wasn't particularly good for their health, and it was changing the density of butter at room temperature. So it's not like the Canadian sector has been a bastion for high product quality forever. And to restate the point, eliminating supply management doesn't just mean that American products get to enter the Canadian market. It also means that international products from Europe or the UK or New Zealand get to enter the Canadian market. And if we're using butter as an example, anyone who's ever tried to find Kerrygold butter from Ireland, which is in high demand, it's a very niche product, grass-fed, etc., and a lot of people love it. It's almost impossible to get here because the tariffs make it so expensive to get. And so getting rid of supply management could mean that you have lower quality products on Canadian shelves, while at the same time meaning you have higher quality products as well. And you ultimately leave it to consumers to figure out what the best path forward is based on their preferences.
And what about subsidies for U.S. farmers and the support that they get from the government? Would that be comparable to what happens in Canada?
Yeah, so I also see this argument where people will say, well, the U.S. provides cash supports to U.S. dairy farmers. That's a subsidy. If you look at 2023, the subsidy for dairy farmers in the United States was in and around $70,000. The cash supports for dairy farms in Canada was around $90,000. So we're actually subsidizing them more. And that doesn't include the protections, the quotas and the tariffs. So the level in which we're protecting our dairy farmers is exponentially higher than in the US. And so if we were to have a conversation with the Americans about what fair trading practices would be, if you were to still have tariffs, you just figure out what that equalization rate is so that they're on par
Mhm.
and call it a day. And I actually think that this could go a long way in terms of trying to calm some of the storm, or at least calling Donald Trump's bluff, right? If we were able to say, okay, we'll meet you on supply management, but no more funny business. If this is really what you want, we're willing to provide some sort of movement or concession or adjustment here, and use that as the negotiating tool to say, okay, we mean business. This is what we're willing to do.
Mhm.
Will you meet us here? And then figure out whether or not Trump is actually serious. But beyond that, I think we should get rid of it for its own sake, because it would be better for all of us.